So last week we just about finished the first 4 chapters, but I wasn't convinced we were done. So today we're going to kind of continue the discussion. And one of the things that you said last week, you were talking about prayer and what happens if you linger in prayer for a long time and nothing happens. And so we're going to kind of cover that a little bit more in depth. I didn't think I gave you enough information, so I'll go back over that. So we're going to talk today about the rest of the story on prayer. You know, some might ask us, well, why are you spending so much time on prayer? Well, why do you think I'm spending so much time on prayer? Prayer is really essential to the Christian life, and we want to get that right. So that's the first thing, the rest of the story on prayer. The second part of this will be the opposition to Nehemiah. And you know, if you try to do anything for the Lord, sooner or later, you're going to be criticized. You're going to be opposed by some. How many have ever tried that and have been criticized and opposed for doing something? Yeah, absolutely. So it happens. And so it's important that we recognize that and even expect it and not be surprised by it. Because sometimes people are surprised by that and they say, I remember when I first became a Christian, I was drinking a beer in my buddy's house, and I was getting ready to go to Thomas Road Baptist Church and Liberty University. Okay, drinking a beer, going to go there. Well, as soon as I went, I was a new believer. As soon as I went, I found out, well, you're not supposed to do that, nor are you supposed to do this, this, and this, and this. But one of the things I was talking to my colleagues about, because I was a teacher at the time, and I was talking, what a great experience this would be. I'm going to go to a Christian environment. I'm not going to have to deal with the politics. I'm not going to have to deal with any of the stuff. I'll tell you what, there were far more politics there than there were in the 11th Ward, and that was Mayor Daley's ward in Chicago, where I grew up. So there were a lot of politics. But so it's important to recognize that even within the Christian community, you're going to receive criticism. And finally, what do we learn about all this? Is this just another nice story, about Nehemiah, about building the wall in 52 days, about all that stuff? Or really, does God want us to learn something from it? I think the latter is the truth. But let's begin with the rest of the story on prayer. Now, last week we partially covered this, but Nehemiah's prayer tells us something about approaching God, doesn't it? And that's really important because effectively, these are the things we're going to cover, but Nehemiah's prayer tells us something about approaching God. And it includes more than petition, doesn't it? You remember what we said last week? It includes also praise, and it includes a reminder of God's promises. And I'm going to come back to that reminder in a minute because that's an important part of prayer as well. It includes confession, it includes repentance, and it includes petition. So there are various elements. As a matter of fact, Psalm 100 tells us to enter his gates with what? Thanksgiving, and his courts with what? Praise. So right there, I think David wrote that psalm, but right there, he's telling us that there's more to prayer than just petition. And we learned that approaching God is about much more. It's about also remembering, I would say. And remembering what? Well, remembering God's goodness to us. How many of you can, if I had to go through right now and have you tell me something God did in his goodness for you, how many of you could raise your hand and tell me about it? Tell me about something, Mike, that God did for you.
Well, I've just been in some pretty sticky situations with litigation and different things, and I just feel like Lord's carried me through that. And it's, when you have people working diligently to come after you financially and attack you from every angle, and every word you say is scrutinized, it's just, there's a peace or something that it's sort of supernatural.
Great. How about other people? Tell me something that God has done for you that you remember. Yes.
Mine is fairly recent. When I found out I had to have a new kidney, I had all the testing done here in Louisville. And I found out through friend of mine that his wife was in charge in the Louisville area of helping people find donors. And so I got in touch with her, and she hooked me up with the head surgeon in University of Cincinnati. This just came out of the blue. So I said he came down here to Louisville with this little organization she had. I interviewed with him. He looked at my test and said, "You're a candidate." 3 weeks later, 3 weeks, on a Saturday night at 10 o'clock, usually you get put on the wait list. On a Saturday night at 10 o'clock, I get a call from the hospital and they have a deceased donor. I had to make the decision right then and there whether to take it or not. And I took it, and it's from there on, I drove there Sunday morning, I had surgery.
And you spend any time in prayer for that? Yeah. Praise God for that. Who else? Anybody else in here? Yeah, Todd.
Shortly after Jen and I been married, we had, Autumn was born, so it was really early in our marriage, but I lost my job, and we were just praying what's going to happen. What are we going to do with Autumn, taking care of her, making sure. We had friends from another church that we were at just came to us that day, had heard that we lost a job, wrote us a check for $500 just so that Autumn can continue to stay in preschool or daycare, so that I could go for job interviews to allow us to be able to do that.
And that just came out of nowhere.
Just out of nowhere.
Anybody else? Yeah, Ken.
When I got out of the Navy in July of '88, we prayed for a job because we had 6 children in private schools and mortgage payments and all that stuff. And I didn't get a job until March of the next year. So we were out of work for basically 9 months, and we didn't have to borrow anything. We didn't have, and I brought me here, my whole family. We raised us 6 kids here in Louisville, and it's been a wonderful experience.
And did God teach you anything about
prayer and a lot of patience?
Yeah, did God teach you anything about prayer in that? Yeah, Deborah, did you have your hand up?
I was just going to say, I feel like all my life God's been there with me and I can feel him. But 20 years ago, Doug had a catastrophic event, health crisis, where you have a 95% mortality rate. And every moment of that day, God pointed out to me every little thing that had happened. And it's a great story. Someday I need to tell it because there's so many little coincidences that happened that day. From the doctor being at the hospital the moment Doug walked in the doors, to my dad being a radiologist who was able to get there with, he had a dissecting aortic aneurysm that killed you within a few minutes of the rupture. And he wouldn't be here today if it weren't for all those things that happened. But God told me that day, I didn't do all this throughout this day for him to die. And I had the doctor the next day tell me, if he wakes up, we're going to be lucky. And I knew all along he's going to wake up and he's going to be fine, because God assured me of that.
Amen. Yeah, Linda.
So our son Derek had 3 open heart surgeries by the time he was 12. And the second one, for some reason, they needed a lot of blood to donate. And Gigi went around to everybody in the Sunday school class and asked them to donate blood for Derek. That was God working through her.
Gigi.
Oh, I was just thinking about Suzanne, our daughter-in-law. When she and Dan first started trying to get pregnant, she couldn't. She was having a very hard time because she has a serious disease called von Willebrand's.
But it's not even von Willebrand's. It's a kind of offshoot of that.
But anyway, the doctor, she went in. They've been trying and praying, and she'd gone in to see her specialist, and he said, "Look, you might as well forget it. You are not going to get pregnant. It's just not going to happen." So she and Dan fasted. Len and I were praying. I was just praying a lot for that. And the week after that, she went back to the same doctor with a test to show him that she was pregnant. He was like dumbfounded. He said, "That can't be." Well, yeah, but God.
Well, Suzanne is not supposed to have any children, and they've had 2 biological children, and then they've adopted 2 additional children. So, what happens when we reflect on? I mean, we could probably, if some of you were less inhibited, we'd probably hear a lot of stories about God's movement in your lives. What does that do when you look at God's movement in your life? When you look at kind of God happenings in your life, what does that do to you? What is that? Yeah. I'm sorry, I didn't hear it.
hope for the future.
Gives you hope for the future. Yeah, John.
You understand that God is listening to your prayers and He's active on those prayers.
And what kind of emotion does that evoke out of you?
Gratitude.
Gratitude. Okay, Thanksgiving. And when we remember what God has done for us, it leads us naturally to Thanksgiving. Deuteronomy 8, Jack, verses 10 through 14, and then verse 18. Listen to these, because this is important. God instructed his people to remember, to remember, to remember. Go ahead.
When you've eaten and are satisfied, praise the Lord your God for the good land he has given you. Be careful that you do not forget the Lord your God, failing to observe his commands, his laws, and his decrees that I'm giving you this day. Otherwise, when you eat and are satisfied, when you build fine houses and settle down, and when your herds and flocks grow large and your silver and gold increase, and all you have is multiplied, then your heart will become proud and you will forget the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. But remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you the ability to produce wealth, and so confirms his covenant, which he swore to your forefathers as it is today.
What's God telling us here? What does God want us to do? He wants us to remember. He wants us to remember. And over and over and over in Scripture, we hear God tell us and tell his people to remember, and yet they don't. They ignore him. They forget him. They defile themselves. Yeah, Tony.
Remembering is also expressed in disobedience.
Yeah, no, go ahead, Tony.
Yeah, so one thing we can do by remembering God is being obedient to his commands. And you can only do that by being in his word, being reminded of what God requires of us.
Absolutely.
And when you're not doing that, you're forgetting God.
And it's easy for us to allow that to happen. And particularly if we're not in his word, if we're not praying, we're not spending time in prayer, we're not spending time in Bible study, we have a tendency to kind of drift off into worshiping whatever. And not that we're idolaters, but we very much are. We have different forms of idolatry than little sticks but we can make our education an idol, can't we? We can make our grandchildren an idol. And one of the biggest idols in the United States today is sports. And we make sports an idol. How many people understand that? Agree with that? I mean, there are people who watch sports 24/7, get their kids involved in sports, and then demand, like Newt Rockney, that they do this, and this. And matter of fact, we know somebody who is on my granddaughter's team who hears it day in and day out, what she's supposed to do, what she's doing wrong, and how she needs to improve. And at some point, that takes the fun out of it, doesn't it? And of course, when my kids were in sports, I was as bad as the next person, wanting them to win. And you tend to lose perspective on it, but it's easy to happen. So let's take a look at Nehemiah's action and what that reveals to us about prayer and planning. And really, his prayer was really key in directing and refining his action. And we learned last week that through prayer, and I mentioned these effective prayer includes praise, reminding us of his goodness and God's promises, thanksgiving, confession, and repentance, and petition. But through that, God directs our actions in advancing his kingdom, because his actions are designed to help advance his kingdom, are they not? I mean, isn't that part of our calling, helping advance his kingdom? How many believe that? How many are involved actively in that? Okay. And that's important. I'm sorry? With grandchildren, okay? Do you know, when I first got saved, I felt my first responsibility was to the Lord, okay, and to my wife. But I felt my next responsibility was the discipleship of my family. Can you understand that? Can you agree with that? Is that right? Sure. If you lose your family, I remember the great stories about Billy Sunday. Who knows who Billy Sunday was? He was a preacher during the Prohibition. What happened to Billy Sunday's sons? I think he had 4 of them. Do you know what happened to Billy Sunday's sons? Billy Sunday preached all over the United States and really all over the world. But his sons became alcoholics. Okay? So what good is it? I mean, you reach thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands, but you lose your family? So really, family's an important priority, but God directs our actions to advance his kingdom. And you remember that Nehemiah prayed for how long? Do you remember how long Nehemiah prayed?
A few months.
Yeah, 3 or 4 months. Okay. And yet you have to be ready to act when God wants you to act. And what God calls, we must act. And we just can't stay praying all the time, or what's going to happen if God calls us to action and we continue to pray? Nothing's going to happen because he's going to use us. What did he tell Esther? What did Mordecai tell Esther?
Even if God made you for such a time as this, even if you're not obedient, he will raise up somebody.
He'll raise somebody else.
But you're
But sometimes God doesn't answer. As I said, Nehemiah waited for 3 or 4 months. Other people have waited for years. Listen, this is what Henry Nouwen said about prayer. And it's about prayer, patience, and waiting on the Lord. Waiting is not wasting time. Now that's difficult to grasp in today's day and age already. Waiting is not wasting time. Why? Why is that difficult for us to grasp? Everything's fast. We got fast food, we got fast evangelism, we got fast all kinds of things.
Wait.
That kind of encapsulates it, Tony. Yeah.
You know, I think that this class is a great model for patience. With our
putting up with me.
With our prayer requests, because you all know we've had people up there on the list for decades.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, that prayer was answered. And doesn't mean they're all going to be answered. But he hears, and it's his time. And I think the class is a great model for that. And it's in the persistence. I mean, how many people on that list we had up there 2 years? You know, well, it's important. It's important.
Go ahead, Don.
At one time, we thought about putting together a shadow box of answered prayers like Mike's talking about. And the things that he's talking about have been up there years. Our son has been up there for years. And other things that we've seen in here. And some of them have been instantaneous, but there's a lot of them where the patience and the prayer for an extended period of time have been fulfilled. Sometimes not the way we envisioned, but basically it was always for God's will and in his betterment, his glory.
Absolutely. And to Mike's point, Carrie, how long did you play for Sandy?
Oh, I think probably about 20 years.
20 years. And what happened?
She is saved.
Yeah. So Bobby and Sue. By the way, they pass along their regrets. They're in Hilton Head, along with Bart and Carol Ann, just kind of hanging out. But Bobby and Sue prayed for their son Kyle for years. How many of you remember that? Every Sunday was Kyle. Well, guess what? Kyle is married, has 6 children. He is a deacon in the church. He is very active in Man Challenge, and he is influencing lots of lives outside of his family. Okay, that's a direct result of prayer, and prayer from some of you folks right here in this class. So, Mike, you're absolutely correct. But Nouwen said that prayer is not wasting time. Waiting patiently in expectations is the foundation of the Christian life. Waiting patiently in expectation. I love that. Well, that's scriptural. How do I know that? David said, what did David say? In the morning, I lay my request before you, and then I wait in expectation. What's that?
It takes faith.
It absolutely takes faith. It's believing despite the circumstances around you. And sometimes that's very difficult, but even that is a test of faith, is it not? So Nehemiah prayed for 3 or 4 months, but there are cases where people have prayed for a lot longer than that. And at times when God doesn't respond, as you said last week, as you questioned last week, so what's our alternative? It's important for us to just continue in prayer. Now, let me give you an example here of Corrie ten Boom. 1944, Corrie ten Boom joined a prayer group that had been praying for Israel and the Jewish people for over 100 years. Can you imagine that? A prayer group who had been praying for over 100 years. Now, that group had been meeting and praying that way. And I think that would define persistent prayer. Would you agree with that? Well, what's interesting about it, she joined in 1944. What happened in 1948? Israel became a nation. And of course, Isaiah prophesied this in 742 BC. 742 BC, 1948.
On this day, May 14th.
So take a look at this. 2,600 years ago, Isaiah 66, 7 and 8, Jack.
Before she goes into labor, she gives birth. Before the pains come upon her, she delivers a son. Who has ever heard of such a thing? Who has ever seen such things? Can a country be born in a day, or a nation be brought forth in a moment? Yet no sooner is Zion in labor than she gives birth to her children.
And then added to that were these promises made 100 years later. So that's still 2,500 years ago in Ezekiel 37, 10 through 14.
So I prophesied as he commanded me, and breath entered them. They came to life and stood up on their feet, a vast army. Then he said to me, Son of man, these bones are the whole house of Israel. They say, our bones are dried up and our hope is gone. We're cut off. Therefore, prophesy and say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says. O my people, I'm going to open your graves and bring you up from them. I will bring you back to the land of Israel. Then you, my people, will know that I am the Lord. When I open your graves and bring you up from them, I will put my spirit in you and you will live, and I will settle you in your own land. Then you will know that I, the Lord, have spoken, and I have done it, declares the Lord.
Now, can you believe that? You're talking about 2,600 years ago, 2,500 years ago, these prophecies are made. And Ezekiel prophesied about Israel's ruin in the first 24 chapters, and then God's judgment on them and as well as nearby nations in chapters 25 through 32. And then Israel's final call for repentance in chapter 33, and then Israel's future restoration, chapters 34 through 48. And actually, many generations of people knew about these promises and prayed for God to fulfill them. It says here in Psalm 122, 6 through 9. Can you read that, Jack?
Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. They shall prosper that love thee. Peace be within thy walls and prosperity within thy palaces. For my brethren and companions' sakes, I will now say, peace be within thee. Because of the house of the Lord our God, I will seek thy good.
So people have prayed for these things for many, even centuries. And that's what we would call persistent prayer. Check this out. Hannah prayed for a child for years. And we know that eventually God answered her prayer, but it wasn't without pain and turmoil and really abuse and mocking. Who did abuse and mocking come from? Her rival, the other wife. And so eventually, though, Hannah gave birth to whom? Samuel. Okay, Samuel, one of the great heroes of the faith. So she prayed for a child for years. Listen to this from E.M. Bounds on the topic of persistent prayer. Ian Bonds is a guy that was around a long time ago. He's what I call an ODG. What's that stand for? Dead guy. Okay. Jack, can you read that?
Persistent praying never faints or grows weary. It is never discouraged. It never yields to cowardice, but is lifted up and sustained by a hope that knows no despair and a faith that will not let go. Persistent praying has patience to wait and strength to continue. It never prepares itself to quit praying, and it refuses to get up from its knees until an answer is received.
So prayer is important, and sometimes it requires us to be persistent. But at times it also requires action. I have to ask you, what happens if Nehemiah prays and prays and prays, and yet he doesn't act? What happens?
He keeps praying.
Huh?
He keeps praying until he does act.
He keeps praying, but he didn't act.
Until he does.
Well, fortunately, he did act. And he got to it quickly. And he finished his work quickly. Nehemiah 2, verses 12 through 16, Jack.
I set out during the night with a few men. I had not told anyone what my God had put in my heart to do for Jerusalem. There were
So he, excuse me, Jack, he set out right away, okay? He set out, okay? He went to Jerusalem, and then he set out. Go ahead.
There were no mounts with me except the one I was riding on. By night, I went out through the valley gate toward the Jackal Well and the Dung Gate, examining the walls of Jerusalem, which had been broken down, and its gates, which had been destroyed by fire. Then I moved on toward the Fountain Gate and the King's Pool, but there was not enough room for my mount to get through. So I went up the valley by night, examining the wall. Finally, I turned back and re-entered through the valley gate. The officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing, because as yet I had said nothing to the Jews or the priests or nobles or officials or any others who would be doing the work.
What do you think Nehemiah is doing here? He goes out by himself. He's the only one. What's he doing? He's inspecting the walls, yes, but what's he doing? What's going on in his head?
Plans.
Huh?
Getting a plan.
He's developing a plan.
Yep.
I'm sorry?
It was security. That's why he did it by himself. It was security. He didn't want to tell everybody what he was doing.
Well, it was security from the other people, but I think he was putting together his game plan. Do you not? And he needed, in order to put together a game plan, he needed to take a look at the scope of work, did he not? See, sometimes people got to lead somebody to do something, they'll jump right in and make 46 mistakes immediately. He wanted to get in there and take a look at the scope of work to make sure that when he developed the game plan, it was in line with the scope of work. Does that make sense? So leadership is about taking action, but it's also being driven by God, who tells us to prepare for that action by planning. And it reminded me, how long did it take him finally, once he began to execute his plan, how long did it take him to complete the work? How long did it take him to complete the work from start to finish, the wall? I'm sorry, go ahead, say it again. 52 days. 52 days, that's good. Nehemiah completed the work. We're going to come to that a little bit. But it reminds me that the Boston Consulting Group has a bunch of articles on a frequent basis. Anybody ever heard of the Boston Consulting Group? Yeah, they're pretty good at what they do, aren't they, Denise? Yeah, and so they put out an article on what's called fast execution. And I read it and I was fascinated by this. Jack, can you read this?
The goal is to achieve what we call fast execution. At its core, fast execution is about minimizing hierarchy and unleashing the creativity and judgment of the people closest to the work. The goal is to use increased autonomy to create an organization in which average people deliver above average performance every day, and learning happens continuously.
See, oftentimes we get the bureaucracy involved, and what does a bureaucracy do to getting things done? It slows it way down. Not that you shouldn't have some structure, But Nehemiah didn't stand over his people and demand that they work and do the wall, complete the wall in a certain way. No, that mortar's going in there wrong. Put it over here. Do it this way. Put that brick, no, not there. Put this brick up. Nehemiah didn't do any of that, did he? He empowered the people and he gave them a job. Gave them a job first. And they said, you take this section of the wall, you and your family, and rebuild it. And then he empowered them to do it quickly without bureaucratic oversight. Would that we would learn that in our government, right? Do we have bureaucracies? You know, I remember this, and I can't tell you the ministry, but I can tell you that there were a couple who were in our class. Actually, they began a ministry, and it was a very effective ministry to help other couples. And they were quite successful in this ministry. And a great number of people were blessed by this ministry and blessed by their work. And by the way, they paid for all the expenses of the ministry. Okay? And when they saw a problem, they moved in and they quickly tried to help and they quickly tried to solve the problem. And they were quite resourceful in what they did, in finding solutions. Well, word started to get around about this ministry. And a church staff member came to them. And all of a sudden he said, you know, we like this ministry and the work you're doing. You've been very successful. So we're going to do this ourselves. Okay. Now the church hired staff, built a budget, and they moved these people out and quickly went from fast execution to slower than slow execution. Why? See, the folks who started the ministry had passion. And they truly were moved to help others. Now, staff weren't as committed. Not that they weren't committed, but staff were nowhere near as committed to these people. And they were slow to get around to things. And within a few years, the staff lost interest and the program was cut. What happened? What happened? What do you think happened, Alvin?
Responsibility where there was no vision.
I'm sorry, say it again.
They assigned responsibility where there was no vision.
They didn't have a vision for it, right? They didn't have a vision for the ministry. They didn't have a vision to help. It was a staff job. A big bureaucracy employing less than committed staff leads to a lack of ownership, leads to a lack of effectiveness. Does that make sense? And Nehemiah showed his leadership this way by not standing over people and telling them exactly. How many people have ever worked for somebody like that, where they have told you not only to do something, giving you responsibility to do it, but then they stand over you and watch and to see how you're doing it and tell you that's wrong. How many people have ever had that experience? What does that do to you? What does that do to your motivation, Alvin?
It destroys your own personal motivation because you feel like there's somebody looking over your shoulder the whole time. And if you don't do it their way, then you have not done it.
And so you're not terribly motivated, are you?
Well, sometimes you're just afraid for your job.
Well, sometimes that happens too. And then sometimes other people leave their job. Okay, people are leaving Chicago in droves. Why? Why? It's not safe. Okay, and the tax is high. Okay, and the return is low. Okay, people are leaving in California in droves. Why? And by the way, they're moving to Florida in droves as well. Why is that? It's a free state. That's exactly right. So we see Nehemiah, and Nehemiah shares his vision, and he shares the city's condition, and then he charges his men. Nehemiah 2, 17, 18, Jack.
Then I said to them, you see the trouble we're in. Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been burned with fire.
Okay, so that's the condition. You see that? That's the condition. He's describing the condition. Go ahead, Jack.
Come, Let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace.
All right, that's the vision, right? You see the vision? So we'll rebuild the wall, and we'll no longer be in disgrace. And by the way, he uses the we word a lot here. Go ahead, Jack.
I also told them about the gracious hand of my God on me and what the king had said to me. They replied, let us start rebuilding. So they began this good work.
So they respond favorably. And they say essentially, okay, let's go. Let's get on with it. And they began rebuilding. And can you see here the relationship between prayer and patience and action and results? They all kind of work together, do they not? And so Nehemiah's prayer is not just one of petition. It involves everything else. Now, as soon as they begin the work, what happens? As soon as they begin to work, what happens? Yeah, opposition arises. So let's look at Nehemiah's opposition. And Nehemiah and his men have started to rebuild the wall. And now remember, in much of chapter 3, he describes the work of the gates. Nehemiah 3, verses 3 and 6, Jack.
The fish gate was rebuilt by the sons of Hassanah. I had this once.
That's why I gave it to you.
They laid its beams and put its doors and bolts and bars in place. The Jeshanah gate was repaired by Joiada, son of Paseah, and Meshullam, son of Besadiah.
Thanks, Jack. Who thinks he did a pretty good job?
That was terrible.
That's pressure, too.
Let me continue. They laid its beams and put its doors and bolts and bars in place.
Good job, Jack. But what's interesting here, Nehemiah wanted to ensure that the gates were attended to. And in fact, in addition to these 2 gates, he talks about the repair of 4 other gates. Why is that? Why is he so focused on the gates here?
That's the entry into the city.
Well, that is the entry in the city. But what else do you know about gates? Of everything in the wall.
They met. Like,
I'm sorry?
almost like a governmental center. They met there.
Well, yeah, they did met there, but what else?
Weakest point.
They're the weakest point. Absolutely. It's another version of the chain is only as strong as its weakest point. And the gates were really their weakest link. When they broke in, oftentimes when they assaulted a city, they broke in through the gates. And they were weak, so they had to kind of reinforce them and make them strong. So all of a sudden, here comes Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem. And they show up. And Sanballat was what they call a Horonite. And his name honors what they call the sin god. Isn't that interesting? He was a Samaritan leader, and his people came from the Achaemenid Empire. See, Jack, you're not the only one. But that's now Iran, okay? And Sanballat's home was likely in modern Huwara, a Palestinian town on the West Bank. Let's take a look for a minute, and I'll show you. And this is the likely home. So you see Huwara in the middle, and you could see here's Jerusalem down here. So you've got Huwara, Jerusalem, and Jerusalem is still today surrounded by Arab nations, okay? And so really, the likely home of Sanballat was also a home of future hostility, and that hostility continues today. It's about 120 miles north of Jerusalem. And the ancestors and descendants of Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem were all traditional enemies of the Jewish people. And they weren't to be trusted. Let's take a look at, by the way, Eliashib, you know who Eliashib was? Eliashib was the high priest, okay? And Eliashib's grandson married Sanballat's daughter. Okay, now this is a high priest. What's wrong with this picture? What's wrong with this picture?
Not an Israelite.
Yeah, is that not a violation of the mandate given in Deuteronomy? way back when, as Moses explained. And yet here you go, you got a high priest who should know better. And yet his grandson is marrying out of the faith. So Sanballat is joined by Tobiah, the Ammonite. Does that ring a bell? Ammonite? And Geshem, the Arab. Now remember, Ammonites were also Semites. They're Abraham's descendants through whom? Through Lot. Okay. I want to take a look at a minute at the Abrahamic lines. You've got Abraham at the top, and those are some of his wives. Keturah, Hagar was his, I guess you'd call her a concubine. She was Sarah's Egyptian slave, and then Sarah. And so this is the line coming down. Hagar gave birth to Ishmael, of course, and you know the rest of that story. Ishmael had 12 sons, and that's a fulfillment of prophecy. Keturah had 6 sons, and Sarah had 1 son, and that was the son of promise, Isaac. Okay. Now let's take a look over here to the right. You've got Nahor, who was married to Milcah. And by the way, Rebecca, you could see, came from Nahor, Abraham's brother. And the third brother was Haran, who gave birth to Lot. And then Lot gave birth to Moab and Amnon, his daughters. And that was a result of an incestuous relationship. And that is why they weren't to interact with the Ammonites, nor could they interact with the Moabites. Okay, so I found this a little bit. You see how this works? And so when Abraham sent his servant for a bride for Isaac, where did he send them? He sent them to his homeland and sent them to Nahor. And Nahor's eventual granddaughter, I believe, gave birth and married Isaac and gave birth to his sons. So you see the chain here. See how it fits together? You don't. I'm gonna look at you now the way you're looking at me. You look confused by something. So let me go on. You can kind of anticipate that for a while. But Ben-Ami was Lot's incestuous grandson. And his father was really the father of the Ammonites. And also, this explains Tobiah's name. Tobiah is Hebrew for God is good. And he's also allied with Sanballat. So Tobiah is Sanballat's friend, and he too marries a Judahite leader's daughter. Now, I don't know if it was somebody who was in the Sanhedrin, who knows, but he married a daughter. So now he's connected. And wow, this gets better and better and better. And you see, Tobiah is an enemy, but he's also connected. He's an enemy, but he's also connected. He's an enemy that resisted Nehemiah, but he's also connected. And the Ammonites also were actually, in some ways, related to Abraham. But they appear more often not as friends, but as enemies. Okay, that's why God said this in Deuteronomy 23, 3-6. Jackie, you read that?
You've made your way around this hill country long enough. Now turn north. Give the people these orders. You're about to pass through the territory of your brothers, the descendants of Esau, who live in Seir. They will be afraid of you, but be very careful. Do not provoke them to war, for I will not give you any of their land, not even enough to put your foot on. I have given Esau the hill country of Seir as his own. You are to pay them in silver for the food you eat and the water you drink.
All right, now, you've got that mandate. In the meantime, Tobiah, Sanballat, and Geshem had been appointed governors by the Persian king, okay? And they're getting a little nervous about this whole thing because the king, they're worried about losing power if they reestablish Jerusalem, Judah comes and reestablishes Jerusalem, builds the wall, builds the temple. All of a sudden, you've got another nation there. And what does that do to their power? At least it challenges it and also diminishes it. And they were worried about the king showing favor to Nehemiah, to the Judahites. But the king had already been showing preferential treatment, and the letters Nehemiah had were proof of that. So each of the governors would lose power if Israel or if Judah returns, and they begin mocking Nehemiah's men. Now, why were they mocking Nehemiah's men as they're building the wall? They want to discourage them. They want them to quit. Nehemiah 2:19 through 20, Jack.
But when Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite official, and Geshem the Arab heard about it, they mocked and ridiculed us. What is this you're doing? They asked. Are you rebelling against the king? I answered them by saying, the God of heaven will give us success. We, his servants, will start rebuilding. But as for you, you have no share in Jerusalem or any claim or historic right to it.
So they're suggesting that Nehemiah is rebelling. They go to the king. They suggest that he's rebelling. And their comments here are meant to intimidate them, but the intimidation doesn't work. And Nehemiah knows God is with him. So instead of quitting, what does Nehemiah do? Nehemiah and his team continue to work, and they work hard and they work fast. Nehemiah 3:1 through 3, Jack.
Eliashib, the high priest, and his fellow priests went to work and rebuilt the sheep gate. They dedicated it and set its doors in place, building as far as the Tower of the 100, which they dedicated, and as far as the Tower of Hananel. The men of Jericho built the adjoining section, and Zakur, son of Imri, built next to them. The fish gate was rebuilt by the sons of Hassenaah. They laid its beams and put its doors and bolts and bars in place. Meremoth, son of Uriah, the son of Hekaz, repaired the next section. Next to him, Meshullam, son of Berechiah, the son of Meshezabel, made repairs, and next to him, Zadok, son of Baana, also made repairs. The next section was repaired by the men of Tekoa, but their nobles would not put their shoulders to the work under their supervisors.
All right, so think about this. Nehemiah starts by describing the work of Eliashib. And who is Eliashib? High priest. Now, why is that important? Why would he take time to begin describing the work by describing Eliashib? Now, the priests were held in high esteem, right? Very high esteem. So why would he be describing Eliashib's work?
An example.
Well, I'm sorry?
To set an example.
In what way?
Well, if he can do it, surely you can do it.
Yeah, if Eliashib can work, so can everybody else. And you see, each family had a section that was assigned to them. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute, but the opposition is there and they're mocking them. And why? Because Nehemiah comes against this mocking. And Nehemiah comes against this mocking again, and he comes against the discouragement they're trying to spread. How does he do it? With prayer. Nehemiah 3:4 and 5, Jack.
The fish gate was rebuilt by the sons of Hassenaah. They laid its beams and put its doors and bolts and bars in place. Meremoth, son of Uriah, the son of Hekaz, repaired the next section. Next to him, Meshullam, son of Berechiah, the son of Meshezabel, made repairs, and next to him, Zadok, son of Baana, also made repairs. The next section was repaired by the men of Tekoa, but their nobles would not put their shoulders to the work under their supervisors.
All right, well, I messed that up pretty well.
No, I think I messed it up. I read ahead of what you had told me last time. So,
all right, can you read also 3:28?
Above the horse gate, the priests made repairs, each in front of his own house.
Eliashib and the priest are referred to as a high priest. He's a high priest of the temple. But the point is, Eliashib was one of the main religious leaders of God's people in Jerusalem. So the point is, if he was out there working, everybody should be working. And it's interesting that Nehemiah, when he prays, if we go back to his prayer, when he prays, he says, God, hear us and turn their reproach on their own heads. Do you remember that last week? We talked about that. Somebody find that real quickly. And he said, God, you gave me a job to do, and I don't need this interruption, so please take care of them. He's doing that in faith. He's going to God saying, take care of them. And the rest of the chapter 3 tells us about each job. And then Nehemiah 4 is mostly about that prayer. Go ahead, Terry.
4:4, hear us, O God, for we are despised. Turn their insults back on our own heads.
Now, it's interesting because the opposition continues mocking. And it's often the case that even when we are successful, even when we have a brief victory, the opposition continues as it did. Does it not? How many people have ever experienced that? Let me ask, have you ever had a spiritual victory and shortly after that you've been attacked? Yeah. That's not a coincidence. It's not a coincidence. Ephesians 6:12, Jack, real quickly.
For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms.
Nehemiah knows this, and he knows other truths, and he doesn't listen to them. He just keeps on working to complete the job that God gave him, but he prays about it. See, he ignores all the noise, but he continues to pray. And Nehemiah has an interesting thing occur. The mockery obviously doesn't work, so they get angry and they ridicule the Jews, only this time they have an army with them. Nehemiah 4:1-2.
When Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, he became angry and was greatly incensed. He ridiculed the Jews, and in the presence of his associates and the army of Samaria, he said, "What are those feeble Jews doing? Will they restore their wall? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they finish in a day? Can they bring the stones back to life from those heaps of rubble, burned as they are?"
So Nehemiah is not worried about this. It might appear to be intimidating, but he just goes on with the work. And he prays. And he prays to God the way that Terry just read. And he also prays in an interesting way. Turn their insults back on their own heads. Give them as plunder in a land of captivity. And he wants God to not cover up their guilt or blot out their sins. Now, isn't that a pretty harsh prayer? Huh? Oh, you said a purgatory prayer?
I am.
I know you've been to the seminary, so explain to everyone what an imprecatory prayer is.
Over here.
Martha.
Okay.
It's a prayer that you make when you ask God to do something against somebody else.
Yeah.
And say it again, imprecatory prayer. I like it. All right. You get a star. Well, last week we ran out of time, and I asked this question. We're told to pray for our enemies, are we not? So how does that work, praying against them? How does that work, praying against them?
For God's good. It's for God's eternal purpose.
Yeah, but what if I decide God's eternal purpose is to smack somebody down?
Well, you're not deciding that. It's his eternal purpose is already decided. And if somebody else is.
Well, what about David when he prayed against his enemies? Psalm 69, 22-24, and then Psalm 109.
May the table set before them become a snare. May it become retribution and a trap.
Hold on a second, Jack. Forget about 109. You can read that later, but go ahead.
May their eyes be darkened so they cannot see, and their backs be bent forever. Pour out your wrath on them. Let your fierce anger overtake them. may their place be deserted. Let there be no one to dwell in their tents. For how far am I going? 24. That's
22 through 24. May their backs be bent forever. Could you imagine that? You're kind of walking around like this. I mean, isn't that what David's saying? Go ahead.
But that, what he meant by that was that may they be slaves to somebody else all their lives, because the backs being bent was really a kind of a figurative remark about people who were constantly slaves at hard labor.
Yeah, Don.
Psalms 109, verse 8, starting in verse 8, say, may their days be few, may another take his place of leadership. May his children be fatherless and his wife a widow. May his children be wandering beggars. And it goes on and on.
Yeah, I know it does go on. Yeah, Gigi.
Well, I looked up imprecatory because I've never even heard of it. And
I'm with you, Gigi.
yeah, but it's
That's a seminary word.
appeals to the justice of God. And I think that's perfectly fine.
Well, that's the point. We're going to come to that in just a minute. Imprecatory prayers are important. Imprecatory, okay, and not imprecatory. Okay. Remember Bart's series on kings? And the kings, before they went into battle, did what? They prayed, and they prayed for victory. And how many victories did God give Hezekiah, Abijah, Asa, David? Because they sought God, and they sought God's wisdom, and they sought God's power and victory over enemies. Yeah, Alvin.
Some of it's absolutely wonderful. It's just inspiring. And that is, after some of them prayed, saying, we're not strong, and they're greatly strength. And then God says, okay, go up, take your priests ahead of you and blow trumpets, but this isn't going to be your battle. This is going to be my battle. Just go top of the mountain and look at what I'm going to do.
And he did.
And he did. And it took them 3 days just to gather the spoil from all the dead, where the armies had turned against each other, and there was not a survivor left. And Israel did not kill a single person.
And who do you think did that?
God.
God. Through whom? I think he did it with his angels. Look at Elijah. When Elijah prayed for a servant to be able to see, and Elijah told him there's more with us than there are with them. And he saw the whole side of the hill full of angels. Okay? I think when we get into spiritual warfare, God oftentimes sends his angels to take care of business. Does he not? Well, what's interesting here is go ahead.
There's a lot of evil. We have a lot of enemies coming against us from a lot of different directions. And God said, pray for your enemies. But some of these things, these prayers and songs are prayers that I can get behind a little better than I can get behind saying, may ruin overtake them by surprise. A little easier than praying.
Yeah.
I'm struggling with
Well, I'm going to come back to that very thing in a minute. Gigi.
Oh, I have a great story about praying against enemies. My daughter Sarah, she's a our daughter Sarah. She is a serious. She just storms the gate, especially when she's defending someone. And Brian was going into a trial with a man who lied and had been saying things about Brian. So Sarah prayed specifically that his tongue would stick to the roof of his mouth. And Brian was in there. Brian's just flabbergasted by Sarah because this happens all the time. He was in there and he almost laughed because this lawyer was stumbling over his words and he was like, oh, he just, and he's thinking, his tongue is sticking to the roof of his mouth. I love it.
Don't mess with Sarah. Romans 12:19 says that vengeance is mine, says the Lord. So where does that leave us? More importantly, how does that all balance with Matthew 5:43 through 45? Real quickly, Jack.
You've heard it, that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous.
And, I was reading an article about this, and I found this one. This is Brooke. That's kind of like Krzyzewski. I'm not really sure how to pronounce that. Zuski. I'm not really sure, but can you read that, Jack? Not his name.
Thank you. When we ask the Lord to judge our enemies, we're not asking God to be unjust. Our enemies deserve God's wrath. For God to judge them is not an injustice. At times, our heroes of the faith prayed against their enemies, but what times are appropriate? There are few such prayers in Scripture. These prayers should not be very common.
So let me ask you, can you pray for an enemy's soul and also pray that God exposes and defeats him? Yeah, Alvin.
In fact, you can pray that by God turning them to righteousness, that God will use that their sins will be actually exposed, so they will turn from their sins and get saved. That's right. Get saved. Because in the long run, God said that he wanted all men to be saved. Therefore, we need to be praying for the salvation of all men.
So you can pray both ways, can you not? And as a matter of fact, oftentimes being exposed like that, being embarrassed by that, sometimes being shamed by that, leads you also to salvation, does it not? So I don't think it's inappropriate for us to pray that God exposes the enemies. And the Jews prayed again, and then they posted a guard day and night to meet their threats because their enemies continued to persist. So Nehemiah changes the game plan a little bit, and they're starting to have doubts. Nehemiah 4:10-12.
Meanwhile, the people in Judah said, "The strength of the laborers is giving out, and there is so much rubble that we cannot rebuild the wall." Also, our enemies said, "Before they know it or see us, we will be right there among them and will kill them and put an end to their work, to the work." Then the Jews who lived near them came and told us 10 times over, "Wherever you turn, they will attack us."
So they're getting a little shaky here. They're getting a little nervous. They're a little bit afraid. And to deal with this, Nehemiah adapts his plan, which again demonstrates his leadership. He posted people at the lower parts of the unfinished wall. He also posted them with families and armed them with swords and spears and bows. Well, why do you think that's important? Well, because, go ahead.
Well, because these bad guys are likely to try to attack them and harm them, and they can defend themselves. They'll be ready.
And he wanted also the enemy to know that. And so the builders all carried their weapons at their side as they worked. Nehemiah 4:16-18, Jack.
From that day on, half of my men did the work, while the other half were equipped with spears, shields, bows, and armor. The officers posted themselves behind all the people of Judah who were building the wall. Those who carried materials did their work with one hand and held a weapon in the other. And each of the builders wore his sword at his side as he worked, but the man who sounded the trumpet stayed with me.
And the builders all carried their weapons, but there was also an alarm system that Nehemiah set up and had them constantly on guard. And this is in Nehemiah 4:19-23. We won't go there today, but essentially that was Nehemiah's system. That was his adaptation. Those were his contingencies. And in leadership, you have to be able to do those things. Now, certainly Nehemiah had thought about this and prayed about this, but then again, he planned. And after that, he took action on the plan. So finally, what do we learn from all this? I don't know that we have time to go through that this week. So we'll get back to it next week.